In August 2024, a shocking event unfolded in the peaceful city of Colorado Springs. A beloved professor, Haleh Abghari, was found brutally murdered in her own home. But what led to such a horrific crime? Who would want to hurt a woman who dedicated her life to education and kindness? The search for answers began, but little did anyone know this case would spiral into one of the most chilling mysteries, with more questions than answers. Haleh was 54 years old, a professor at the University of Colorado in Colorado Springs. She was respected by her students and admired by her colleagues. Known for her intelligence and her passion for teaching, Haleh had a life that many would envy. But as her family, friends, and the entire community would soon discover, her life would come to an abrupt and violent end. On a quiet morning in August 2024, Haleh's neighbors grew concerned. They hadn't seen her for several days, and that was unusual. She was always friendly, always active, so they decided to check on her. What they found when they arrived at her home would shake them to the core. Haleh was lying in her living room, lifeless. She had been brutally stabbed multiple times. The police were called immediately, and the investigation began. But here's the first mystery. There were no signs of forced entry. The door was unlocked, and nothing seemed to be missing from the house. It was as if Haleh knew the person who killed her. As the investigation unfolded, one name began to surface: Cesar Lorenzo Wilson, a 53-year-old man with a criminal history. Wilson had somehow crossed paths with Haleh. But the big question was, how? What could connect a respected professor with a man like him? Wilson was quickly identified as a suspect. He had been involved in several criminal activities in the past, and the authorities were working to piece together his connection to Haleh. But despite his criminal record, there was little evidence linking him directly to the murder. This left the investigators with even more questions. Was Cesar Lorenzo Wilson just a man in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or did he have a personal connection with Haleh that could explain such a horrific crime? The authorities weren't sure, and the more they dug, the more puzzling it became. Now imagine for a moment, you're in Colorado Springs, a town known for its beautiful scenery, its peaceful neighborhoods, and its close-knit community. You would never expect something like this to happen. But then, the unthinkable happens. A woman you know and respect is taken from the world in a brutal and violent manner, and it feels like the answers are just out of reach. The police couldn't find a motive. Haleh had no known enemies, no apparent threats in her life. She wasn't involved in anything that would make her a target. So why was she killed? Was it a random act of violence, or was it something more calculated? The lack of evidence left everyone baffled. No fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, no clear connection between the victim and the suspect. It seemed like a perfect storm of confusion. The kind of case that keeps you awake at night, wondering what really happened. And then there was the question of Cesar Lorenzo Wilson. Why was he the primary suspect? What did he know about Haleh? The authorities had a hard time connecting the dots, but they knew one thing: Wilson was on the run. After the murder, he disappeared, and the search for him intensified. Days turned into weeks, and still no one could find him. The police issued an arrest warrant, but Wilson had vanished without a trace. How could someone with such a criminal background disappear so easily? And more importantly, was he responsible for Haleh's death? But there was something about this case that didn't sit right. The more the police learned about Wilson's background, the more questions arose. What if he wasn't just another criminal? What if he was connected to Haleh in a way no one expected? As the investigation continued, new details began to emerge. Haleh's family and friends were interviewed, her colleagues were questioned, and her life was examined under a magnifying glass. But still, no answers. Everyone who knew Haleh described her as a kind, gentle soul, someone who would never be involved in anything that could lead to such violence. It became clear that this wasn't just about solving a murder. It was about uncovering a mystery that ran deeper than anyone could have imagined. Was there something from Haleh's past that had come back to haunt her, something she had kept hidden from everyone around her? Or was the truth even darker than anyone could have anticipated? The authorities were still piecing together the timeline of events. What had happened in the days leading up to Haleh's death? Had she known her killer? Was there a confrontation before the murder? These were questions that the investigators were desperate to answer. In the meantime, the people of Colorado Springs were left with a sense of unease. A professor, a woman of intelligence and integrity, had been murdered, and no one could explain why. The community was shaken, and people began to wonder, could there be a murderer living among them? As the investigation drew on, the question of Cesar Lorenzo Wilson's whereabouts became even more pressing. Why had he disappeared? Was he hiding, or was he being protected? And if he was indeed the killer, would he ever face justice? This case, with all its twists and turns, had everyone on edge. People in Colorado Springs were talking about it constantly, wondering how something like this could happen. A respected woman, a beloved professor, taken from the world in the most violent way imaginable. And still, the mystery remained unsolved. There were so many unanswered questions, so many pieces of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. The investigators had their theories, but none of them seemed to lead to a clear conclusion, and with each passing day, the search for Cesar Lorenzo Wilson continued, but he remained elusive. Could the truth be out there, waiting to be uncovered? Or was the mystery of Haleh Abghari's murder destined to remain unsolved forever? As the case continued to unfold, more and more people began to wonder, what if the killer was still out there, living among us, watching and waiting? As the weeks passed, more pieces of the puzzle started to emerge, but they only deepened the mystery surrounding Haleh Abghari's murder. The authorities had launched a full-scale manhunt for Cesar Lorenzo Wilson, but despite their best efforts, he remained elusive. No one could quite understand how he had disappeared without a trace. Then, a breakthrough came when an anonymous tip was received, claiming that Wilson had been spotted in a nearby city. The police scrambled to follow up on the lead. But once again, it turned out to be a dead end. It was as if Wilson was playing some twisted game, always staying one step ahead of the law. Meanwhile, Haleh's family and friends were left to grieve, struggling to make sense of her death. They spoke of her kindness, her generosity, and her unwavering dedication to her work. They couldn't fathom why anyone would want to harm her, let alone murder her in such a brutal fashion. It was at this point that the case began to take on a more personal tone. The detectives, who had initially seen it as just another murder to solve, began to feel the weight of Haleh's death. She was not just another victim. She was someone's daughter, sister, friend, and colleague. The sense of injustice began to grow as they realized just how little they knew about the motive behind this senseless killing. With each passing day, the case became more and more frustrating. Investigators had no concrete evidence tying Wilson to the crime, but the circumstantial evidence was hard to ignore. Witnesses had seen him near Haleh's neighborhood in the days leading up to her death. There were reports of strange behavior, sightings of him lurking around her home. But even these sightings weren't enough to build a solid case. The authorities couldn't arrest Wilson based on suspicion alone. They needed hard evidence, and time was running out. The pressure was mounting on the police to find answers, not only for the family of Haleh, but for the entire community, who were living in fear, unsure of where the danger might be hiding. What was even more chilling was the thought that Wilson might not be working alone. The possibility that Haleh's murder was part of a larger, more complicated plan began to surface. Had there been others involved? Could this be the work of a group? Or was Wilson truly acting alone? As investigators dug deeper into Wilson's background, they uncovered more disturbing details. He had a history of violent behavior, having been arrested multiple times over the years. But what stood out was his ability to manipulate situations, to slip through the cracks of the justice system time and time again. Was this part of a larger pattern? Was Wilson a mastermind behind something much more sinister than anyone had realized? The more the police learned about Wilson, the more the case seemed to spiral into the unknown. He had connections with various individuals, some of whom were known to be dangerous. But there was no clear motive, no clear reason why he would target Haleh, and yet the evidence pointed toward him as the primary suspect. The question lingered: what drove him to murder Haleh in cold blood? It was during this time that a theory began to form among the investigators. Some believed that Wilson's motive wasn't just about a random act of violence, it was something more personal. Could he have known Haleh from a previous encounter? Perhaps a secret from her past had caught up with her, and she had unwittingly become entangled in a dangerous web of deceit and betrayal. But still there were no answers. Every theory seemed to raise more questions than it answered. What was the connection between Haleh and Wilson? And why was he still on the run, evading capture with such apparent ease? As the case began to grow colder, the community of Colorado Springs was left in suspense. Every time the police issued an update, it seemed to lead to more dead ends. The case had become a haunting mystery that refused to be solved. The more people learned about Haleh's life, the more tragic her death seemed to be. She had been a symbol of hope and inspiration to so many, and now she was gone, leaving behind a cloud of unanswered questions. As investigators continued to follow up on leads, they began to suspect that Wilson had planned this murder for some time. The calculated nature of the crime suggested that it wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment act. Could this have been premeditated? Was there something about Haleh's life, something about her past, that had triggered this deadly act? The frustration of not knowing was palpable. People in the community couldn't stop talking about Haleh's murder, unable to shake the eerie feeling that something was terribly wrong. What had happened to her? Why hadn't the police caught Wilson yet? And more importantly, would justice ever be served? Then, as the months went by, another twist unfolded. A person who claimed to have seen Wilson in the vicinity of Haleh's home on the night of the murder came forward. This new lead seemed promising. At last, there was a potential eyewitness who could provide crucial information. But as the police followed up on this tip, they discovered something unexpected. The eyewitness had a history of mental health issues, and their credibility came into question. The investigation was at a standstill once again. With so many false leads and no concrete evidence, the case seemed to be slipping through the cracks. And as the search for Cesar Lorenzo Wilson continued, the questions remained. Was he truly the killer? Or was there another, more shocking explanation waiting to be uncovered? This case had become a puzzle, with pieces that just didn't fit. Every lead seemed to open up new questions, new avenues of investigation, but no clear answers. The mystery of Haleh Abghari's murder was far from solved, and the chilling thought lingered. Could the truth ever be uncovered? Or would this remain one of the most baffling unsolved mysteries in Colorado Springs history?